I've entitled this lesson, Even When We Don't Understand. One of the important benefits that we gain from the study of the Old Testament is an understanding and a confidence that God is always in control of the affairs of the world. And it's important that we know that and believe that. I would say it's more important now than it's ever been, but I suspect that's probably not true. It's always been important. We learn principles that help us to understand and accept difficult circumstances in our own life. And we learn principles that help us also to learn what we need to be concerned about and what we don't need to be concerned about. And we really need that lesson today, don't we? In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 6, it says, now those things that it's referring to are the events of the Exodus, the parting of the waters and the coming out of Egypt, and all of the events that happened during the wandering, particularly the times when the people were disobedient and God punished them. And so he said, now those things were written as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things. And then a little bit later in that same chapter, but in the same context, he says, now these things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come. So if you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation, and then he gives us some principles. No temptation has seized you except what is common to man. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. These Old Testament scriptures teach us two of the most important practical things that we must know in order to enable us to stay faithful to God through whatever happens in this world and whatever happens in our individual lives. No temptation has seized you but what's common to man. That deals with the struggles in our own personal life. And then he adds the next statement, God is faithful. And that encourages us to remain faithful to the very end of our life, because God is going to be true to everything that he said. And knowing these two things, no temptation has taken you, but others have experienced the same thing, and God is faithful, those two things motivate us to obey God in everything, even when we don't understand. And I might say especially when we don't understand. And I think, go back and think of those in the Old Testament that were held up as examples for us. Abraham certainly jumps out. Do you think Abraham understood everything that God told him? Whenever he appeared to him in Genesis chapter 12, and he said, I'll make your descendants as numberless as the sands of the sea and the stars of the heaven. He didn't have any children. You think there might have been some doubts along the way? He was 75 years old when God first called him in Genesis 12. 75. When God gave him that promise that he was going to become a great nation. 10 years pass. He's 85 years old. No child. Genesis chapter 15, verse 1 and 2, he tells God, Eliezer, my servant, will be my heir, because I have no children. God assures him again that Sarah will have a son. More time passes, and the incident with Hagar and his son, as a result of her being Ishmael. And I think of why he did that, why he and Sarah did that. And I think it must have been because they're trying to understand. They're old. And the clock is ticking. Maybe the clock may have stopped by this time, and they need to help God out some. 13 years more pass, but now he has an heir, Ishmael, 13 years old. In Genesis chapter 17, he's 99 years old. And God appears to him and said, I told you that Sarah is going to have a son. And she will have a son by this time next year. And so he is 100 years old when Isaac is born. And yet Abraham is commended as the father of the faithful in Romans 4:16. And you remember the story. The story continues. God had him send away Hagar and Ishmael. And then some years later, he commanded him to sacrifice his son Isaac, whom God had specifically named as the promised child, when God had specifically forbade human sacrifice. He tells him to take his only son and sacrifice him. Did he understand? And yet, he obeyed, even though he couldn't have completely understood. And in Genesis chapter 22, beginning in verse 15, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this is at the offering of his son Isaac, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sands of the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations of the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. And the point being that God blessed Abraham and his descendants because he obeyed, even when he didn't understand. In fact, as you read through the Old Testament, you'll find a number of times when God would have otherwise either punished or annihilated Israel, but because of Abraham's faith and because he was honoring Abraham and his faith and his obedience, then he didn't punish them as severely as he would have otherwise. And so I wonder how many of us are standing in the shade of trees that somebody before us planted, and our lives are blessed because of the faith of some of our predecessors that we are totally unaware of. And I'm sure that some generations later there were some blessings that came upon individual people as a result of Abraham's faithfulness that they didn't even know why. They didn't understand God's reasoning. And then I think of other people like Rahab. She protected the spies and sent to Jericho whenever they were sent to Jericho to spy out the land. Why did she protect them? In Joshua chapter 2, verse 1, and then verse 8 through 13, she explains to the spies that she knows and all the inhabitants, and she said, we're all in fear because we know that your God parted the Red Sea for you to cross. And we also know what happened and how you destroyed the two kings of the Amorites. And they were seriously outnumbered, and yet they defeated them. And so Rahab put two and two together. She didn't have a lot to go on, but she had enough to go on that she risked her life, and she went against everything that had been taught to her, her religion, her family, everything that had been taught to her and risk her life to take care of those spies. And then there was Job. And then there was Job. Even though he was one big question mark, as he sat on top of that ash heap, scraping his sores, looking out over 10 freshly dug graves, all of his children, taken in a day. Even though he was there, he remained faithful to God. And he said in Job 13:3, surely I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to reason, and that word means argue my case with God. He didn't understand. How could he understand? How could anyone in his situation have understood? And then in verse 15 and 16, he will say, after he said, I wish that I could argue my case before God, he will say, though he slay me, yet I will trust in him. He will also be my salvation. And then there was Job. He continued to trust and obey God even when he couldn't have possibly understood. God's faithfulness enabled every one of these and many, many more to obey even when they didn't understand. See, knowing that God is faithful and that he'll not allow us to be tempted above that which we're able to bear will keep us from becoming discouraged if we'll truly believe that in our heart, even when we don't understand. There are things that happen in our life that we don't understand. And one of our first reactions is, why is God allowing this to be done to me? Or why is God doing this to me? There are so many things in this life that would discourage us. There's family problems, there's health problems, there's problems on our job, there's problems with friends, there's money problems, our pride gets hurt, there's loneliness, there's sexual temptations, there's the fear of death, there are doubts, there are emotional problems, and we could go on and on and on. And Satan is going to try all of them on us. And when he smells a weakness, he's going to drive in. How can we remain faithful through the problems in life? How can we be, as the Hebrew writer will say after listing all of those people, those faithful through the ages, how can we be one of those who are tortured and refuse to be released? They could have simply said words that would have spared their life, but they didn't. Well, one of the things that we need to be reminded of, and we know it, but sometimes we need to hear it, this life is temporary. This too shall pass. It will end, our life will end in death, unless the Lord comes back. Nothing can happen to you that others have not experienced. And I think of those for instance, in a nursing home. You think it's bad in a nursing home? I know lots of people that would give anything they had to be in a nursing home. If we went around this auditorium and every person listed our individual problems, would there be one unique problem among us? Would there be one problem that others have not experienced and overcome? And the answer is no. There is nothing that has happened to you that is not common to man. And then we need to remember not only about our life, it is temporary, we need to remember about God. Consider him faithful who made the promise. Consider him faithful who made the promise. And if we really do, and we believe that God's in control, then we can hang on through anything. Or as I used to hear as a kid, you can fight a bear with a switch for a little while. What promises has God given us? Well, we could just go on listing them over and over, couldn't we? But we need to be reminded of some of them. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. Can you picture yourself in that scene? We need to be able to. We need to be able to see ourselves, particularly in times of difficulty, as hearing the Lord say, well done, good, faithful servant. We need to have those words in our brain. 1 Corinthians 9:25, everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown of laurel that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. James chapter 1, verse 12, blessed is a man who perseveres under trial, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the victor's crown, the life that God has promised to those who love him. Revelation 2:10. Do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in jail to test you, and you will suffer persecution. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. That's some promise, isn't it? That's the kind of promise that if you believe truly that God is faithful, and if you understand that not anything can happen to you that hasn't happened to faithful Christians before who have endured it, then you can endure and you can overcome. You know, as I thought about this lesson, and there are so many different ways to approach faith and the concept of it, maybe the most practical definition of faith that I can think of would be staying faithful, continuing to believe, continuing to trust God when we don't understand. That's faith. And if you flip the coin over, what do we gain if we allow the troubles of this life to discourage us and we decide we're not going to go to church anymore? We decide it's not worth it. We become discouraged, and as Job's wife encouraged him to do, curse God and die. What have you gained? 2 Corinthians chapter 4 is an incredibly encouraging section of Scripture when you feel overwhelmed by life's problems. And you might just want to somewhere make a little note of that whenever times get difficult. The entire chapter, but we won't read the entire chapter. But in chapter 4, beginning in verse 16, the very end, he started out in verse 1. He says, since we through God's mercy have this ministry, we do not lose heart. And then he will say in verse 16, therefore we do not lose heart. So everything between verse 1 and verse 16 is giving you reasons why you should not. We as Christians must not lose heart or become discouraged. And then he summarizes it by saying in verse 16, therefore we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we're wasting away, yet inwardly we're being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. And you remember what the definition of faith is in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, right? Faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we cannot see. That's what faith is. And as Christians, the righteous will live how? By faith, right? And so we fix our eyes constantly and consistently on what we can't see, what these eyes can't see. And inwardly, we're convinced and we know without any doubt whatsoever that one day we're going to stand before our Maker. And if we've remained faithful to the end, we're going to hear him say, well done, good faithful servant. Enter into the joys of your Lord that were prepared for you since the foundation of the earth. I'm looking forward to that day, aren't you? It's real. It's going to be real. We're going to look at one another and smile whenever one of us hears him say that to us. It's going to happen. That day will come. And there's a great cloud of witnesses that's described in Hebrews 11 and 12. And that great cloud of witnesses, he says, that surrounds us, they're pulling for you. They're pulling for me and for you to not become discouraged and not quit and not allow what's happening in our life or what may be about to happen in our lives, to not let that discourage us. But we see through eyes of faith. And so just a little bit longer, and he who comes will come, while we stand and sing.